So we're going to look very closely at the First Amendment in this class. And this PowerPoint is pretty much about the challenges to the First Amendment. So the First Amendment, if you're not familiar with it, I'll read it, is Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. If you read the Sedition Act of 1918, I believe that you might find that it sounds like it's impinging on our freedom of speech. Again, the First Amendment is a part of the Bill of Rights. It was passed December 15th, 1791. And if you look at some of the things that happened during World War I, which was, by the way, the most protested war in the history of our country, you would be surprised at that because you might think that it was the Vietnam War. But as you can see, the government worked really hard to keep people from protesting World War I. So Schneck or Schenek, I'm not really sure how you pronounce it, versus the United States. That was a big deal for our freedoms and specifically the freedom of speech. A unanimous Supreme Court, in an opinion by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, concluded that the defendants who distributed flyers to draft age men urging resistance to induction could be convicted of an attempt to obstruct the draft, a criminal offense. So the bottom line is Schneck was convicted under the Espionage Act, and Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion. I'm not going to read the whole opinion, but basically the idea is if the person who is doing something seems to create a clear and present danger, then the government has the right to silence them. And he believed that during wartime, we needed to be even more careful about what people said. And Oliver Wendell Holmes was an associate justice, and he served on the Supreme Court from 1902 to 1932. So here's another guy who ended up in prison. He was a newspaper guy, basically a journalist, and he made the mistake of criticizing the U.S.'s involvement in foreign wars. He was found guilty of violating the Espionage Act, and another unanimous decision by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said that it was a willful obstruction of America's recruitment efforts and was not protected by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So, yet another person who ended up in jail just for writing something. This case, Abrams v. the United States, the defendants were convicted on the basis of two leaflets they printed and threw from windows of a building in New York City. One leaflet signed Revolutionist denounced the sending of American troops to Russia. The second leaflet, written in Yiddish, denounced the war and the U.S. efforts to impede the Russian Revolution. It advocated the cessation of production of weapons to be used against Soviet Russia. The defendants were charged and convicted of inciting resistance to the war effort and urging curtailment of production of essential war material. Now, here's something interesting, though. They were sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. The Supreme Court did rule 7-2 that the defendant's freedom of speech protected by the First Amendment was not violated. And if you recall, all those other ones, it was unanimous. Now we see a little bit of split in the Supreme Court. It's now 7-2. One of the justices who dissented was none other than Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. And if you recall, he was the one who wrote the court's unanimous decision. But in this point, he has decided that they did not represent a clear and present danger. So the court's starting to change. You need to read about this lady. She was a big part of the women's suffrage movement, but was also a big believer in communism. She was arrested for giving a speech in California, in Oakland, California. And once again, the Supreme Court upheld the decision of the lower courts, and she was convicted. So here we are in 1940, and they've changed. They've gotten rid of the Espionage Act, decided it was unconstitutional, and replaced it with the Smith Act. What do you think? Is this constitutional? This is the case that really changed our freedoms. So the case goes that Clarence Brandenburg, a Ku Klux Klan, KKK leader in rural Ohio, contacted a reporter in Cincinnati and invited him to cover a KKK rally that would take place in downtown Cincinnati. Portions of the rally were filmed. They showed people in robes, and one of the speeches made reference to the possibility of revengeance against blacks, Jews, and those who supported them. One of the speeches also claimed that our president, our Congress, our Supreme Court continues to suppress the white Caucasian race, and announced plans for a march on Washington to take place on the 4th of July. Brandenburg was charged with advocating violence under Ohio's criminal syndicism statute for his participation in the rally and for the speech he made. Of course, it went to appeal, made it all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a shocker, the court struck down Ohio's criminal statute, and it said that it broadly prohibited the mere advocacy of violence. This 1964 ruling ended up having a domino effect on all those other court cases we looked at before. Whitney v. California was overruled, Schneck v. United States, Abrams v. United States, Gitlow v. New York, and Dennis v. United States, all overturned. So here we are in 1992, and if you're wondering how our freedoms are now, well, here's a good case to give us an idea. This Raw v. the City of St. Paul. It turns out that basically, a teenager and several other teenagers allegedly assembled a crudely made cross by taping together broken chair legs. The cross was then erected and burned in the front yard of an African American family that lived across the street from the house where this petitioner, who they're calling Rav, was staying. The petitioner, who was a juvenile at the time, was charged with 2 counts, one of which was a violation of St. Paul bias motivated crime ordinance. And the ordinance basically said you can't say and do stuff that is motivated by criminal activity. Turns out that the Supreme Court did not see it that way, said that it was a violation of our First Amendment rights, and struck it down. I don't believe the Patriot Act has been challenged, but someone please correct me if I'm wrong. It was passed in 2001 after the 9/11 attacks, and seems that it does violate our First Amendment rights. Today, hate speech can be convicted if it meets all three of these criteria. It's got to be a direct threat, and it's got to make you, the person who's threatened, fear bodily harm to the point of being killed.